Thanks, Julie.
Good morning. Let me begin by apologising for our slight delay due to a few technical issues, but glad you're all here to join us, and a happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. I'd like to start by introducing our guests today. I'm delighted to introduce myself, Julie Semrell. I'm an AFP Director and your host for today. I'm also joined by my colleagues James Pestle, AFP Director, and Paul Hollick, our Chair. Our presenters today are Alison Moriarty of Drive, previously Risk Director at Arriva Bus UK, and Fleet Road Risk and Compliance Manager at Skanska. Also Emma Loveday from Drive Tech. Emma was previously Road Risk Lead at Thames Water and Fleet Risk and Communications Specialist at Mighty. And lastly, Chris Connors, Head of Facilities and Fleet at Countryside Properties. Before we begin the presentations, I'd like to advise you that we'll be recording this webinar to allow members to review content at a later stage, and we'll be having the Q&A session following our presentations as per the agenda. I'd like to now hand over to Paul Hollick, who's going to provide an update on AFP's Risk and Compliance and Health Committee. Paul.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Julie. So I'd just like to give a brief overview of the Risk Compliance and Health Committee. So we've got 16 seats. It's chaired by Martin Evans of JAMA. Marie Gerald is our Deputy Chair, BCA. We've also got fleet operators Matt Hammond, Tony Murphy, Eric Bristow, Ted Sacchi, Steve Roper, Paul Tate, Jacob Tallymark and Colin Knight. And ably assisted by our fleet experts on the committee as well, in the form of Mark Cartwright, Malcolm Maycock of Licence Bureau, Emma Loveday of Drive Tech, Alison Moriarty of Drive, both of who will be speaking today, Dr. Lisa Dawn of Cranfield University, and Dave Parry of FMG. So it's a really nice mix of group, and they've done a lot of things over the last 3 sessions in terms of output. James, next slide, please. The key things that the guys have been looking at in the committee are best practice to manage a driver business journey, driver wellbeing and mental health, which is a really important topic for the AFP. As we, particularly with COVID, we've seen an uptick in the mental health area, and we want to try and make sure that we do more as a fleet organisation around advice on mental health. Grey fleet management and business journey management. Grey fleet management hints and tips, and obviously part of the topic is health, so it will be remiss of us not to include COVID-19 and also post-COVID-19 operational challenges. So these guys are looking deep into all these topics and how it impacts fleet operations, fleet operators, and how we can create some documentation, be it lobbying, be it best practice guides, be it hints and tips, to be able to support our member base. Next slide, please, James. So just some of the key findings from the Risk Compliance and Health Committee that are coming out, and I'm not going to obviously step over our speakers in a minute. So I'm kind of removing the GreyFleet areas out of this discussion, but a number of the committee members have been implementing or considering implementing initiatives around installing cameras. The use of telematics, particularly traffic light performance telematics systems out there that can log driver behaviour and provide warning notes as and when there's particular issues around harsh braking, swerving and speeding events. Introduction of incident reporting apps and how to manage first notification of loss, how to deal with driver interviews once they have had an incident, and how to deal with that to make sure that they don't repeat the same mistake twice or the same issue twice. But not just that as well, also how to deal with the mental element of the post-accident and making sure that they're fit and well once they've had an accident and are able to get behind the wheel again. The use of fuel reduction tools and also issuing notifications on harsh braking as well, which again is linked to telemetry solutions. The group has also been looking at deploying grey fleet management tools and what best practices around that. Looking at how to obtain buy-in from business and senior management to get the budget and to get the activity levels that they really want. Of course, it's really important with occupational road risk topics and health topics that senior managers and the business at the top really buy into the whole program as well. And obviously it's equally important to sell the benefits to drivers to ensure good adoption as well. And I'm sure Chris, Emma and Alison later in their sessions will also talk about how to get buy-in from management, senior board director, C-suite and drivers to be able to drive the agenda within their organisation as well. Without that buy-in, nothing's going to happen. Okay. James, next slide, please. So the group also have been looking at driver wellbeing and mental health. So the group has discussed the need for companies to recognise the importance of driver wellbeing and mental health issues within their organisation. And the committee has recommended raising the profile and focus of driver wellbeing and mental health by driving should be part of the job description and managed accordingly, which I think we'd imagine as fleet operators we would all agree. Mental health courses and mental health first aiders should be made available within an organisation if they're at a size to make them available. And we can then start to discuss it as a proper topic. Driver wellbeing should be part of a broader health and safety discussion within fleets. Fleet operators can sometimes as well find it difficult to have regular dialogue with drivers about occupational road risk, driver wellbeing and mental health topics. Sometimes we forget that we're sat in our office or now at home post-COVID, and it can be really difficult to reach out and start to have sensible dialogue with individual drivers about how they can improve their driver wellbeing. So therefore, how can we develop tools, more effective tools like Zoom, not necessarily like we had this morning, but with Zoom, teams to be able to reach out to drivers and also local representatives and line managers to be able to start to regularly support our fleet around these topics. And of course, then also not forgetting to work with our supply chain and reinforce standards with our supply chain, particularly if we've got agency workers, and we will have business partners where vehicles are being liveried up, try and speak properly, liveried up that with our own logos on, but they're actually not our employees, and obviously making sure that we include and encompass driver wellbeing and mental health within those topics as well. So that's all being discussed by the committee. James, next slide, please. They've also been looking at COVID-19. We did a webinar back in July about this, which you can find on the AFP website if you want to download it and have a listen and a view. But just to touch some of those points about how fleets have been managing with COVID-19, of course, coronavirus has made significant changes to our diet, both in short, medium and long term. For most businesses, either good or bad. Some businesses have gone crazy because they're like Amazon and supermarkets where their business models completely changed in a good way. And others have been struggling in hospitality, retail, aviation, and the other issue has remained around furloughing staff and business survival. In terms of considerations that we need to think about is obviously realigning lease agreements. The expectation is generally that most vehicles will be doing lower mileage unless you're driving vans for delivery. So working with our lease cos within our own organisation to look at what the mileage is we'll be doing post-COVID. Recognise the risk of drivers moving into cash, particularly in the short term. And we're actually starting to see as an industry now some drivers that are taking a car allowance and actually not even running a car, which is unusual. But of course, with the lack of business miles driven, and as long as the the company is happy to give a car allowance to an employee as a benefit, and they are still committed to be able to use a vehicle in company business, then we're starting to see a population within our industry of employees that take the cash and don't have a permanent car and will use spot rentals and second vehicles and train and taxis and Ubers instead of actually running a car now as well. So we need to start to think about that within our own diet and how we manage that process as fleet managers. Obviously, the great news, particularly with benefit in kind tax changing, and on vans, the benefit in kind tax changes this April as well for personal use on vans, but on cars it changed last year, and we're starting to see a massive uptake in EVs. And of course, with less miles as well, EVs become a lot more of a better alternative as well. I mean, the range, I would argue anyway, the range is so good, it doesn't actually make a difference. But now EV adoption is rapidly expanding in the UK marketplace, which is a great thing. Obviously, we need to think about compliance on FEVs, whole life costs, driver home charging, new drivers with those fleets that are expanding rapidly, how to onboard new drivers quickly, make sure that they've got permits to drive, make sure that they understand what's required from a business and occupational road risk perspective is really important from a COVID-19 perspective. Roles, of course, are changing. And have been changing rapidly for a lot of employees, reduced employee count, reallocation of vehicles, people working from home, people changing their contracts of employment, so they're working from home now rather than working in the office, which means then the commute into the office is actually a business trip rather than a personal trip. And also for us as fleet managers, how we are reallocating vehicles and moving that car park around and terminating vehicles early for those drivers that want to go into EVs or don't want a vehicle at all is really a challenge for us. So again, the committee has been looking at all that type of stuff. Fear of public transport. Obviously, we've seen with COVID that public transport usage is down to about 20% of normal levels. And people are starting to, and I'm starting to see this with a lot of our members, of them driving now into London rather than taking the train into London, which again is something as us as fleet managers we need to think about when we're looking at business trips, and whether that's something that we want to continue in the long term. Obviously, we're talking about it today, but a comprehensive grey fleet management process is required and absolutely essential for most fleets now, particularly for fleet managers that want to add value to their organisation. Grey fleet is really important. And alternative communication methods are required within the business. We're all very much now used to Teams and Zoom. I definitely wasn't used to that pre-COVID. And I think that's here to stay. So again, the committee is looking at all those types of things as well. Okay. So the other things as well in terms of the key findings from the Risk Compliance and Health Committee are the topics how to manage a business trip and grey fleet management, but I desperately don't want to steal the thunder of our upcoming fantastic speakers. So I will now hand over back to Julie to introduce our speakers for the day. So thanks very much for your time. Julie, you're on silent.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Paul. The topic for our two presentations today is effective management of your grey fleet. Alison and Emma will now give us a best practice view. Over to you.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Julie. So I'll just start off by, I think it's important to explain to people what grey fleet is, and I think there is a bit of a wider understanding in the industry now because it is becoming more prevalent with lots of companies. You know, vehicles aren't really moving, so company cars have been sat on driveways for most of the year, and people are questioning the BIK charge on those because they've not been using them. So it is becoming more prevalent, and I think there's a danger we think of grey fleet of just being those people who have a cash allowance instead of a company car. But also we've got to remember that there's a whole other and possibly higher risk part of grey fleet that are people who use their own vehicles that they already have, so they don't receive a cash allowance. And then these people are used to be termed occasional users, but I think they are becoming part of the normal fleet in terms of the amount of miles that they drive. So, you know, any vehicle that's used on behalf of business and where people are claiming expenses for it, I make up part of the grey fleet. So really anything that's not owned, leased and insured by the company, but people are claiming mileage for, that forms part of your grey fleet business. And I think going into that, and I know Emma's going to talk about that now on this next slide, is it's understanding what a business journey is. And I think, you know, yes, it's not commuting, but there are a whole set of journeys that we don't think of as being a business journey. And obviously the use of those vehicles then brings that vehicle into that grey fleet arena. So on the next slide now, please, we'll just hand over to Emma to explain what a business journey constitutes.
Thanks, Alison. So understanding what constitutes a business journey is really, really important, and it's still, as Alison said, is quite misunderstood in the industry. The reason why we need to know what a business journey is that this will allow us as fleet professionals to definitively know which drivers fall into our grey fleet populations and therefore which ones we are responsible for. So a business journey, put simply, is any journey undertaken on behalf of the employer between the employee's permanent workplace and any other temporary workplace. Also, travel between an employee's home and a temporary workplace, or travel between two temporary workplaces, is also classed as a business journey. You should remember that an employee can only have one permanent workplace. So any travel to other workplaces, other depots, other offices, venues for training courses, etc., that will all be classed as a business journey, and if it's undertaken on behalf of you as the employer. So as Alison said, regular commuting, you just need to remember that it's from home to one permanent workplace, and therefore that doesn't constitute a business journey. That's the only thing that's exempt, I suppose. A couple of potentially ambiguous examples would be if you have an employee that's dropping off some work post on the way home at the post office. That travel to the post office, even though it's on that employee's way home, because it's being undertaken on behalf of you as the employer, that still technically is classed as a business journey. And therefore the normal GreyFleet vehicle and driver requirements apply, which me and Alison will talk about a little bit later on. Another example that is likely to have occurred quite recently because of COVID is that we now have employees that are working from home because of restrictions. So an example could be you have an employee that a couple of days a week is working from home and a couple of days a week is working back in the workplace. When they travel to that workplace, that is still classed as their regular commute, even though they are working from home now part-time, because there's been no change in their contract, because they're still one permanent place of work is the office, that is classed as a regular commute and therefore doesn't fall under the GreyFleet requirements, and also they can't claim mileage reimbursement either on that journey into the office. Next slide. I'm going to touch on legal compliance and minimum requirements as well for you as an employer. So as an employer, you owe the same duty of care under health and safety law to staff who drive their own vehicles for work, as they do, or as you do, to employees who drive company owned, provided, leased or hired vehicles. As with company provided vehicles, there are checks that need to be carried out on both the vehicle and the employees that drive them on any company related business, no matter how infrequently. For drivers, as an employer, you need to ensure that all GreyFleet drivers are legally and adequately licensed to drive, i.e. that they have a valid driving licence and that they're not disqualified, and licence checks need to be carried out at least annually. Drivers' insurance details also need to be checked. You need to ensure that they are suitably insured to use their vehicle for business journeys, so they need to have business use insurance. With regards to the vehicles, as an employer, you need to check that the vehicles have a current MOT certificate if applicable, and also that the vehicle is appropriately taxed. These are the bare minimum requirements for you as an employer with your GreyFleet vehicles. Next slide.
Okay, so looking at driver and vehicle best practice, I'm going to really, excuse me, focus on the driver side of it, being from a behavioural safety background. And I think it's easy to forget that, well, two things, that one, someone who's driving for work is conducting a work activity. And we know that, I think the industry is beginning to pick up on that it is not only a work activity, but the highest risk work activity that most of your employees will ever do. And people around heavy goods vehicles, vans, and to an extent now company cars, people are really thinking about that and trying to encompass all the things, all the good practice around looking after drivers and ensuring they're driving safely. But GreyFleet is an area that is often missed out. So even when we look at, as all the things that Emma was talking about then with license checks and things like that, GreyFleet is slightly different, because if you're looking at a driver's performance, excuse me, one of the things that is an indicator is looking at telematics data, if that's on a commercial vehicle, but also looking at, you know, damage, off-hire damage, looking at how many incidents drivers are having. And you simply don't know that with a GreyFleet driver. You know, there's no, you don't really inspect that vehicle. So you might get service history and things, but if a driver has a collision in the car, unless they decide to tell you, there's no way you would know that. So for me, it's really about being proactive and encouraging the driver of GreyFleet to understand that that's a work activity and you're just as interested in how they do that as how they do everything else. So it's not just about when they get to site or when they get to the office that they're visiting that we're bothered about what they're doing. It's actually that journey in between. So what we need to do really is very much focus on communication and education with drivers, because actually getting them to understand that we take it seriously as an employer then makes them understand it's important. Because if we don't decide to do any training or ask any questions or talk about fatigue and you know, all those good things, drugs and alcohol, all the things that we need to be really encompassing in driver training, then why should they be bothered? You know, if we're not looking at it as part and parcel of the work that they do and the service they provide to us, then there's no reason for them to take it seriously. So I think really all that proactive stuff is almost more important with a GreyFleet driver. You know, we need to be making sure that they're having training based very much on behaviours. You know, I think we can't get away from that vehicles don't have collisions and roads aren't dangerous. It's the person behind the wheel that has collisions and you know, how they drive on that road that makes it dangerous. So we really need to look at that and discuss with, you know, particularly with GreyFleet drivers, because you're not necessarily getting the data, so the stop-start times of journeys and things, that we need to be really, really careful about checking things like mileage claims to see, are people actually driving too many miles in a day? Because there's nothing else that really gives you that information. And a driver, you know, we all know that we think, oh, well, we might just push it an extra half an hour today because I need to get home after this meeting. And it really is incumbent on you as an employer to make sure that they're given all the same care. You know, I always say about EU hours and domestic hours rules for driving, you're no more or less fatigued depending on what little bit of legislation happens to cover what you do. And that extends to GreyFleet drivers as well. And I think car drivers in a lot of companies might be the people who actually do the longest hours, because they do a day and they travel to it and travel back from it, and it's not really looked at as part of the working day in their heads sometimes, as well as by the company. So I think we really need to look at driver behaviours, putting some training in, letting them know how important it is, talking about fatigue, talking about things like sleep apnea, and, you know, doing really important well-being training as well as anything else. And I think, you know, that fits in very well with what Emma's going to sort of look at now in terms of the safety of the vehicle, because we absolutely would insist that a vehicle has an MOT, but who's MOTing the drivers, you know, and they are the highest risk part of that vehicle and that journey. So once, you know, we need to really look at that and then look at all the things that Emma's going to come on now to on this slide, sorry, but just look about the best practice in terms of vehicles.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. The driver is super, super important, absolutely. But also, as well as an employer, like we spoke about, there is a duty of care for the vehicles as well. So best practice for managing GreyFleet vehicles is to ensure that you have minimum vehicle standards included within your fleet policies and communicated really well with your drivers. So key elements to consider are NCAP safety ratings of vehicles, emission levels, required safety features, so things such as seat belts. It seems really, really obvious, but you should put that in your policy that any GreyFleet vehicle or any vehicle used on behalf of the business needs to have seat belts. And also as well, essential breakdown cover, often overlooked, but again, really, really important that any vehicle that's driven on behalf of the business, whether it's owned or whether it's owned by the employee, needs to have breakdown cover. So consider as well, best practice is enforcing standards such as a maximum age of a vehicle and maybe a maximum CO2 limit. So that's, you know, quite prevalent at the moment. You know, large organisations have got CSR agendas, they've got carbon footprint emission reduction targets. So by having a maximum CO2 limit on any vehicle driven on business will obviously help you achieve that. It is worth noting, though, that your employees still have their own responsibilities in regards to the vehicles that they drive. So they're still responsible for ensuring that their vehicle complies with road traffic law, and that is also in a safe and roadworthy condition and is fit for purpose. So the employee still does have responsibility as well in regards to the vehicle that they drive on business for you. Next slide.
I think as well, Emma, I was just going to say, I think as well, looking at the kind of the driver and vehicle together, we wouldn't really let anybody take a van or a heavy goods vehicle out without doing a daily walk round check. And I think part of that, as Emma says, making sure that that vehicle is in roadworthy condition, is encouraging GreyFleet drivers. Yes, it might be your own vehicle, but actually just do those little checks in the morning. You know, the things that could mean you won't have an incident or you will have an incident. Checking tyres, making sure that your brakes are working, making sure your lights are working. So I think, you know, to try and kind of encourage GreyFleet drivers to do that as well. You know, it might not be that it's recorded because you won't be defect reporting to the company, but it's still extremely important in terms of their safety and other road users' safety as well.
Absolutely. Next slide, please, James. So this is our final slide. I suppose we can't really talk about the future of GreyFleet without mentioning COVID, and I know Paul's already spoken about that earlier. So COVID and the impact that this had and is still having on the GreyFleet landscape, really. So this past year has forced organisations to adapt and to adopt working from home as the default, really. Company cars have been sat on drives, gathering dust, only used for the weekly kind of supermarket shop. We've already spoken about that already. So this increase in working from home during the pandemic is believed to have led and is still leading to an increase in GreyFleet driver populations, an increase in cash allowance takers, and a reduction in company car schemes and company cars on the road. These next 12 months are going to be really interesting, and it's going to be really telling of the impact COVID has had on this fleet area. With that in mind, it's really, really important as organisations that you have comprehensive GreyFleet policies and processes in place. And I think the things that we're going to talk about in the Q&A is actually how do you get the ball rolling? How do you start with implementing a GreyFleet policy if you haven't already got one in place? So that's it from me. Alison, do you just want to round up nicely with the organisational safety and culture around driving as well?
Yeah, so I think because I'm from an HCQ background and moved into fleet safety, it's always been part of my agenda to include it into the overall health and safety culture of your business. And unfortunately, we know that even in a lot of large fleets and companies who have a fantastic safety record occupationally, that not necessarily looking at GreyFleet as part of that overall safety culture. And I think, as Emma said, because we know for an absolute fact that GreyFleet is growing, and we can see that even from some clients that we're working with who are actually moving away completely from company cars, that it's more and more important to make sure that those GreyFleet drivers are encompassed in that overall safety culture. And Paul mentioned earlier, obviously, you know, we've been moving a lot to Zoom and Teams, and I think as restrictions are starting to lift now, certainly in Wales, they're lifting a little bit quicker where I live, but throughout the country they are. We need to think about, you know, we're all kind of thrutching to get out of our little offices and actually have human contact with people. But I think we need to look at, can we still do some of the things we do from home? Because although it is a bit of a cliche, you know, the safest journey is the one we don't take. And even when it starts to open up, I think we need to really shift from, can I now do a journey, to should I now do a journey? And I think there is a massive difference in those two. So that's kind of how I would round it up. I just think we need to be really, really careful that we don't just all get out on the road now, and because it's legal to do so. It's, you know, is it safe to do so, and what can we do as companies to protect the people that work for us?
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Alison and Emma, for an informative presentation as always. I'd now like to introduce you to Chris Connors, who's going to share his approach.
Chris, can we hand over to you, please? Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Thank you, Julie, for the introduction. Firstly, I would just like to say thank you to Emma and Alison and Paul before that. I'm still learning. I've got a page of notes I've just taken from there around what I perhaps need to take away and what I need to do. And I think that's perhaps where I wanted to start, was just that to be honest with everybody, in that we're on a journey with our fleet. This presentation may look like we've got a plan, and we definitely have got an idea and a plan, but it's not a perfect plan, and there will be challenges along the way. So it's about us all coming together and learn. So if we can go to the next slide, please, James. So for me, I'm Chris Connors, Head of Facilities and Fleet for Countryside. We have 2 internal team members supporting me on the fleet side. Currently, we run a fleet of around 1,470 drivers, which is just over 60 LCVs, 400 accompanied car drivers, and 960 car allowance drivers. That is approximately which qualify for a company vehicle. We have some occasional incidental uses, I think, as Alison and Emma referred to, the types of journeys that go on. So we're aware of a few drivers that support the business that perhaps go a little bit under the radar, but the bulk of our grey fleet is made up of our allowance drivers. Interestingly for us, we've seen a real shift in this split between the car take-up and the allowance take-up. If we looked at it a couple of years ago, there was around about 50-50 split. We've now really pushed to nearly 70% of our drivers are taking the allowance. Possibly probably to do a little bit to do with COVID, a little bit to do with benefit. Also, the slow uptake of electric vehicle as people get more used to that mode of transport. I'd like to think it was temporary that we was going to such a high percentage of allowance drivers. However, with new ways of working and coming out of COVID, I'm not so sure. So we need to be gearing up for the fact that the allowance drivers and the grey fleet is going to be more prevalent than it was a couple of years ago. James. So what did we do? We looked at this a couple of years ago and looked at it, and that's probably a good example of how long it's taken us to get to where we are now. Is that our new car policy was 2 years in the working before it was actually released. So to start with, we looked at what was the purpose of the car policy, and then looked at it in kind of, it gave a choice for people as to whether they wanted to take the car or the allowance. We needed a framework so that we could manage our fleet. And crucially, and one of the big changes that we made was to actually see people as drivers and see our employees as drivers, rather than just seeing it as fleet. And because when we look at fleet, we talked about company vehicles, and we were very, very strong on the management of company vehicles. We strong on the management of our grey fleet at all. So we made the decision that we needed to view our fleet as drivers and include everybody in that. So we looked at some of the priorities for the business. Safety is a massive priority for our business. We're a construction, we're a house builder. We have a safety first approach out on site, and we take it incredibly seriously, and we have a very strong record in that field. So we needed a car policy for the business that would support safety. We also needed a car policy and a car offering that supported the recruitment and retention. It's quite a competitive field, and we're always looking to make sure we get the best employees. So we needed to make sure that this car policy supported our needs there. We needed to be able to manage cost and risk. And also we wanted to make sure that our employees could get to and from workplaces. You know, it's, driver and employee downtime is something that doesn't get spoken about too much, but that's a big cost to the business. If people are not able to attend, that the knock-on effect from that. So that was our business priorities. From a fleet perspective, we then looked at it started with the GreyFleet of a real challenge, because we've got a lack of control and a lack of information and a lack of management to what's going on. So we needed to make sure we had something that helped us support that. We wanted to give a framework for people that gave them information and hopefully educated them on how we wanted them to behave. So we took the decision that this was going to be a document that enabled them, that took them on the proverbial journey, that showed them what they could do, what their options were, but crucially as well, how we expected them to behave. We needed some tools in there to help us manage behaviour when it wasn't quite up to the standards that we were looking for. And it just needed to, dovetail with our whole approach to fleet management. Then we need to look at it from the employee perspective. What was they interested in? So choice would be a big thing. All our staff, I'm sure, like most staff, want choice. They want to see the car policy as a benefit. There's a financial cost or a financial implication to them. And again, safety was another thing. How to make sure our employees are safe, and then they would want to be kept safe. We then started to think about what was our general approach to other policies, mainly because we wanted ours to be consistent with the group's approach. We wanted to make sure that we was part of a suite of policies that adhered to our values. So looking at our policies, we were reassured to see that they all have a safety first culture. They're all, which we're trying to make a sort of a friendly policies and employer of choice. So providing people options, opportunities, events, so life-changing events that we can cope with and we can deal with, so that we looked at that approach. And the other policies gave sufficient detail and clarity of what was expected of people. We then looked at what was recognised good practice. So things like what all of this seminar here now, also other stuff from the AFP, but there's lots of sources, there's lots of information out there as to what we should be doing. I personally love the fleet industry because everybody is so helpful to each other. People people will gladly share their knowledge, share their experiences, and you can learn so much from it. I've grown into fleet, and the challenges I face are the challenges that everybody else has faced. So there will be somebody like an Alison and Emma or a Paul that will gladly help and share their knowledge with you. And then finally, we looked at what our competitors were doing, which was done mainly because what we wanted to do was we wanted to ensure our approach and our policy was going to be accepted by all and by the business and our employees. So, we're a growing organisation. We've had a number of new starters come in, so we wanted to understand what their expectations would be, what they'd had previously. We wanted to look at where we could sit and make sure that we was delivering a policy and an approach that was consistent with our competitors, and that we wasn't trying to do anything out on our own. And reassuringly, across our competitors, there's generally a really good approach to fleet management. Next slide, please, James. So what was our objectives? As I mentioned, it was about getting a clear policy. We wanted to make sure we discussed and looked at whether we should separate the GreyFleet from the company car offering. But it was just, we felt that having one area where people could go to that gave them the information they needed, regardless of how they procured the vehicle that they were driving. So we wanted a policy that applied to all. We really wanted a policy that focused on vehicle and driver safety. Previous car policies we've done focused a lot about the company car offering, the choice, and what was available, and really promoted the offering. We didn't have enough in there about vehicle and driver safety, and we really needed to bring that to the forefront and actually provide people with that information that they needed. We needed the last 2 points on the slide there. We needed to be realistic. We only had the resources we've got available. We needed to be able to manage it. We need to be able to deliver it. There was no point us pretending that we was going to go from where we were to where we needed to be overnight. It was going to be a time we needed to look at what we was managing as well, other workloads. You know, we've got things around electric vehicles coming to the forefront in terms of the car offering, the car choice. So we needed to be realistic and put the grey fleet as part of that and have a plan that we felt we could deliver. We also needed to make sure that, as I've mentioned before, we got the business and the employee buy-in, and that we didn't want to go. We wanted to take people on a journey that meant that they come on board, and that we tried to look at where the problems and the challenges were going to come from. Next slide, please, James. So, as mentioned, time and resource challenges around that. We challenges around getting the business support. So. GreyFleet's not a sexy topic within our organisation. It's definitely one that the business take for granted, and it's one where we needed to use a number of sources to start to educate. Fortunately, we had a platform through our risk management committee and our strong safety focus on site, where where we could raise the issue, we could highlight it, and then we could talk to them about what we needed to do. But there was, and it remains from the business perspective, it is about trying to find a balance and keeping our employees at work. So stuff that we implement can't be too onerous in terms of time, can't be too restrictive in what we're trying to do. So it was really was a balance, and deciding on the criteria and the detail what we was going to do was a challenge. We looked at every option from, I think Emma mentioned bare minimum in terms of what you could do. We looked at everything from that to going up to having strict around age, around vehicle usage, around mileage, around safety, the number of doors on a car, and everything in between. We then spent a bit of time looking at the biggest challenge we felt would be non-compliance. What are we going to do if somebody doesn't actually adhere to what we're asking them to do? How would we manage that? How would we tackle it? Where would it end up? The last thing we wanted to do was implement an approach that caused us that we wouldn't be able to follow through with. So to start with, we looked at how we would deal, which was to really encourage, educate, and work with people. Explain to them the safety reasons, what we're trying to do, the importance of what we're trying to do, and try and get their business, their buy-in and the business's buy-in. We also then spoke to the business about some last resorts. So if all other avenues are found, ultimately we could remove the allowance from the drivers, or we could stop business driving and business travel for those that didn't comply. But hopefully we would do enough in the interim period to get people to comply with what we was looking at. Next slide, please, James. So phase one, January this year, we launched at long last our new car policy. So we settled on some of our allowance requirements, and I would say that we settled on a minimal requirement. And that was done deliberately after the conversations we had before, was to let's start with something, let's measure that, and then let's see where it takes us. So when we looked at the vehicle, we decided it needed to be suitable for the grade and role. And that's because, in terms of our allowance drivers, we offer monthly allowances from £325 to £1,325. We have site-based roles and we have office-based roles. So we wanted to take a view that the vehicle needed to be suitable for the grade and role. We also come about to deciding it needed to be available all working times, which is something that is quite surprising in a way that we would need to put that in. But with ways of working now, I think we are going to see car sharing, and I think we are going to see people not different types of vehicle ownership. So at this moment in time, we felt, because of that our business, that we wanted our drivers to be available to go to different sites or different locations as and when we needed them to do. Complying with all legislation, it's one that it is the most basic requirement, but we felt we needed to actually put that in print and give us something to go back to. Keeping the car clean and generally good condition, no visible road. This was about protecting our brand image. Parking on our sites, we're showcasing our business all the time. Also making sure people realise that there is responsibility on them on the vehicle that they're driving. And again, that leads on to the maintaining to the manufacturer's recommendations. That's a safety protocol for me, is to make sure that their vehicle is regularly serviced, regularly looked at, and gives us the avenue for checking and making sure that we don't insist on it goes to a main dealer group. We insist on it just following the whatever that manufacturer's recommendation is. Onto the person. We full driving license. This had actually been in place for a number of years, so this wasn't a new requirement, nor was the business insurance, but making sure that we had that documented. And breakdown cover was one that we added, and this was, again, this was our view to make sure that people could get to a safe place if something happened on the road, is making sure that they had that cover there. We also added a section that said that anybody that didn't qualify for the car allowance, that our preferred use, because we wouldn't have done the vehicle checks on them, was them to take a rental car. However, if they didn't feel comfortable driving a rental car, that this policy and this approach still applied. We had we then finished the allowance driver section with a sentence which I've just read to you that says, the company has a duty of care for the vehicle and the driver when it's being used for company business, regardless of how the vehicle is provided. Therefore, with the exception of the company car specific sections, the rest of this policy applies to all our allowance drivers. So it was really setting out that this policy was for everybody, and that the small section on the company car choice was the only bit that the allowance drivers didn't need to do. Previously, it was felt within the business that the car policy was about your company car and not about those that are driving on business. We followed it up with some sections about vehicle and driver safety. We mentioned the highway code, which is a great document for setting out some basic safety requirements of what we're all expected to do. Mention about making sure the vehicle is fit for purpose and the checks we would expect to see going on there. And then stuff about the driver herself. So mirroring what Alison and Emma had said is that we've put on there the we expect to behave in a way that keeps themselves and other road users as safe as possible. We put out stuff around eyesight testing, passengers and seat belts and child restraint, also stuff around distractions and making sure that they're limited, and just give people a bit of guidance around how they should conduct themselves on a journey. Next slide, please, James. So we're now into phase 2, which is where we're looking at how we implement our new policy. So this is going to be ongoing over a 6-month window. We are asking our drivers to evidence compliance to our criteria. So we started with new starters and people that switched from the company car into the allowance. 2 main reasons for this. One, it gave us the opportunity to test what we was doing to start with. And secondly, it was on with an audience that we felt we would have more success in getting them to provide the documents easier, because there was more conversations going on. Fortunately, that went really, really well. So we're now rolling out across all drivers. So we're at the moment of the very friendly emails and asking people to provide the documents and talking to them. We're following up with telephone calls to try and understand what they can supply, and crucially, if there's any non-compliance about what we need to do. We've broken people that are non-compliant into two categories. The first is that they've got a document missing. So it might be business insurance, for example, and just talking to them about what they need to do and giving them, we're generally giving people a month to correct any non-compliance around it. The second area, which is in a way a little bit more worrying for us, is those that are not responding to us. So at the moment, it's very early stages, but what we will be looking to do is publish some lead tables by region about how many people are responding, what the levels of compliance. I'm sure, like most organisations, our staff are quite competitive, so they will not want to see themselves, and that each regional business will want to see themselves doing well on that league table. We are recording the data, and then we've started to look at things like renewal dates and that. So in terms of license check, we do annual license checks for the standard. Those with 4 to 6 points, they are checked every 6 months. Those with 7 or more points, they're checked every 3 months. We're recording details on vehicle ownership. We're recording details on insurance and the breakdown cover, and if appropriate, the MOT certificate. So we're starting to build up that suite of information for each vehicle, which will lend itself to doing a more regular check, and hopefully we've got alerts that we can help remind people when their insurance is due as much as anything else. Next slide, please, James. So the phase 3, which is where we will get to for September, what are we going to do? We're going to have a general review of what vehicles we've got broken down by grade and role. At the moment, we cannot tell you what vehicles we have. So we don't know whether there is a real problem or whether we've got a good suite of vehicles. We believe from the early data that we've got a good suite of vehicles, but we'll be looking at the trends. We'll then be looking at whether our criteria and our compliance to it, whether we've gone far enough. And so that's where we might start considering about adding safety ratings for vehicles, adding mileage limits, adding age limits, and just looking at what the next phase is. I think it's really important. You've probably heard me mention about business and employee feedback and getting them involved. This is we are the custodians of the company car policy and the great fleet management. We can't do everything in our little team, so we need the business and the employee buy-in. So we need to seek their feedback as to how they've found the process, what the benefits are. Also understand a little bit from them about what the future holds. How do they see, particularly on the grey fleet? Is it going to be around car ownership? Are they going to be people sharing vehicles? Is it that a family can go down to having one car between them because journeys are limited, and that actually that would meet the needs of the business? How would we then manage if the vehicle wasn't in the person's name? How would we then manage about that the availability of the vehicle all the time? So it's really, really important that they are part of this process. And then we want to look at the management process for us. How did we feel about it? How was it for us? How much effort did we have to put in? What are the lessons learned? What are the challenges that we faced? What was the good that come out of it? And I think crucially, did we actually achieve what we set out to do, which is to have a safe fleet, to make sure that our drivers are in vehicles that we can manage and that we can monitor and that they can get from A to B in a safe way. This will hopefully enable us to recommend any changes to policy. We are committed to this being an ongoing process for us. We want to make sure we continue to manage it. Back to the very first point about the number of allowance drivers, we can't bury our heads in the sand. The allowance drivers are part of our fleet. They are becoming more prevalent, and we need to make sure that we have a system for managing them in the same way we would have with the company car. At this point, I'd just like to say thank you for anyone that's listened, and hand back to Julie.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was really informative again. James, I understand we've already had a number of questions. Would you like to share the first one?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. So I'm going to ask the panel, perhaps starting with Alison and Emma, in regards to what considerations do I have to take into account if I want to operate a grey fleet?
I think, sorry, Emma, do you want to go first?
I was just going to say, I think the first thing and the most important thing for me, the operator grey and the drivers that drive it, they're no different to your company car drivers, to your commercial fleet drivers. They shouldn't be treated any differently. Everything that you do for your commercial fleet and for your commercial drivers will still be applicable and should still be applicable for any grey fleet vehicles and grey fleet drivers. I think that's really important for me. Alison?
Yeah, I agree, Emma. I think that it's got to just be part and parcel of your whole kind of fleet policy. I do think one thing that absolutely needs to be in place, and Chris really explained this very well, is looking at, what do we do if people aren't compliant? You have to have a policy in place. You need a framework to be able to go back to a driver and say, no, this is how we run our grey fleet. Because otherwise you can't say people aren't complying if you don't have something written, whether that be a policy or whether that be a procedure, it doesn't matter. And I think, it is very difficult. It's much more difficult to make sure people are compliant, but I think linking them engaging properly in terms of having the right documentation and sending the documentation in, link it to expenses, make it impossible for a driver to actually claim expenses for a business journey until you've got all those documents checked. And I think that it is really, really important that there's something in the background, as Chris has done, to say, line in the sand, this is how as a company we run our GreyFleet and this is what we expect from you.
It's enforcing that policy as well. So if you have consequences, is making sure that the stakeholders involved in that enforcement, you know, will do that if things aren't compliant. A permit to drive is also a really useful tool. Having a permit to drive in place to complete all the actions before authorising someone to drive and authorising someone to claim mileage, that is also a really good and effective way to make sure that you can get compliance from your GreyFleet drivers. And
Chris, have you got any comment at all on this point?
Just to echo what Alison has said, I think for me, it was about educating the business to see people as drivers and to make sure that there's a level of importance placed that safety. Driving is probably the most risky thing that anybody does. So just really, you know, kind of, we're the subject expert matters. The responsibility I see on us as fleet managers is to be able to ensure that our business is armed with that information. And to take the GreyFleet as a very, very important part of that.
Okay, I have a second question, although Chris, you have covered this very, very well in your presentation, but I'm being asked Hello?
I think your line's breaking up, Julie. I think the question, what's the process to implement a GreyFleet policy encompassing set criteria or controls to ensure I cover my duty of care obligations and corporate responsibility or goals? Who was that question open to? I think we'll go to Chris, you first, please.
Yeah, it's. I think hopefully I covered some of it in the presentation. Is that it's looking at your duty of care. It's looking at control measures, and it's looking at we would manage how are you going to implement and manage it. It's taking it's being clear on what you're expecting to start with, and having that documented to give a framework that people are working within.
I think I would also add to that, I think we've kind of touched on it, but it's giving the same gravitas to GreyFleet drivers in terms of that being a work activity as anything else anybody does. You know, and I keep going back to training because education is such a huge factor in this, that we need to be putting, you know, we need to be telling drivers this is a really important thing that you're doing. It's very dangerous, you know, it's very risky, and we want to give it an equal parity in terms of how we approach safety with anything else that we do in the business.
I think for me as a first point, if you are kind of starting at ground zero with a GreyFleet policy, is to make sure that you have a responsible person within the organisation. It needs to have somebody that's responsible for it. It needs to have accountability. And we would definitely advocate at the AFP that should be the fleet manager. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise. It should be part of the fleet manager's role to manage GreyFleet compliance and have that policy in place. Again, you know, communication is really, really key, and you really need to get buy-in early on from a lot of key stakeholders in your organisation. This isn't going to be a singular fleet thing. You need stakeholders from HR, maybe reward, also CSR as well. So your sustainability colleagues, you really do need as many, you know, internal stakeholders as well involved in writing the policy and getting their input and engagement with it, because it covers all of their elements and all of their roles as well.
Great, thank you very much for that. And probably to Alison and Emma, from your experience of sort of supporting fleet operators, can you advise on the parameters I should incorporate around the use of GreyFleet vehicles? And I'm going to incorporate a second part to that question that we've been asked as well. Is it reasonable to include vehicle choice and age for GreyFleet choosers as well?
Absolutely, 100% yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, you know, I think what you've got to realise is that it's no different to any other part of health and safety legislation. You know, you can't put anyone at risk, whether that be the employee or other people, through your acts or omissions. And part of that is, you know, would you allow somebody to go out on the road for you in a 20-year-old car, 2 seats and no seatbelt? You just would not allow that, because you still have that duty of care to assess that person and ensure that that person is safe when they go out to do the job for you. I also think, you know, in terms of putting parameters around it, this will be different dependent on the sort of business that you run, but I think you really need to think very carefully about maximum mileage. So putting a maximum mileage allowed to be claimed on a GreyFleet vehicle.
Before they get put into a company car scheme.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think benchmarking was really important. So if you are starting from ground zero, having a benchmark as well. So you need something that's going to be realistic. And if you haven't got that visibility of the vehicles that are being driven at the moment on business, how can you start to set those parameters and actually understand what your GreyFleet driver population looks like? So benchmarking is really important, and having that visibility first off before you even start to consider about maximum, minimums, parameters and things is also important.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add on that point. From us, if you've got issues with people in your GreyFleet, if you can offer a company car alternative, that's the conversation, so that you're not just going up there with them saying that vehicle's not compliant, that vehicle's not suitable, that, you know, you're helping them. They may not have the funds or the methods to be able to procure an alternative vehicle. So that's where your company car offering can offer a solution for them.
Okay. We have another question now. How can I set my expenses system to ensure the GreyFleet complies with policy? Chris?
With difficulty in my experience, because we try to do that in there. So we have it as when people are claiming for business mileage, that there's a checkbox to say that they've read and understood the car policy. It's one of the things that we want to work more on, is that can we find a link between what we're doing and what our finance doing in terms of paying expenses, to make sure that there is that data. It's one that if you can make it work, I think such a great idea, because that gives people the incentive to make sure that they are compliant, because they won't be able to get the money back. But certainly, if anyone's got a solution, I'm welcome to it.
I think, yeah, I mean, importantly, I actually, when I worked at Skanska, we had people were unable to claim expenses, physically unable to actually use the expensive system if they hadn't got the documentation in place. And actually, I believe the old, that's very rude. I mean, the previous car fleet manager from Skanska is on this call, Lee Corrigan, who put a lot of these things in place. And actually, compliance was rocketed in terms of people sending documentation in and making sure that everything was in place as it should be, because nobody wants to do mileage and not get paid for it. And we actually managed to link our fleet management system in with our expenses system, so that they physically couldn't go on and actually claim expenses unless they'd got that in place.
Okay, Chris, I think you've sort of touched on that in this answer, but in the last answer. But when you were looking at GreyFleet management, what was the best data source to work out how many GreyFleet miles your company has been doing?
So the data source we had available to us was from our expense system. So we got the business mileage claimed for company car drivers, for allowance drivers, and for non-qualifying drivers. So that was the source of information we had. One of the challenges for us is possibly not, because I'm not sure that everybody claims, particularly the example of, you know, somebody dropping off the post on their way home from work. I don't believe that person claims his mileage for that journey, so that's going under the radar. So we've started to look at, you know, the issues from the mileage that people are claiming the money from. But that's something that we need to explore more on about, is getting an understanding of what miles are being driven.
Yeah. Okay, one for Emma and Alison now. What incentives or carrots can you provide GreyFleet drivers to be compliant, and what sticks do you provide?
I don't know about you, Alex, go on.
I was going to say, I think the carrot and stick are the same thing. Yeah. Claiming their expenses for the mileage they're driving. You know, it's quite a generous allowance, and part of that, obviously, the reason it's so much higher, the HMRC suggested rates are because part of that price per mile is so that you can have your business insurance, make sure you have your services, maintain your vehicle properly. So, you know, I would say that's a huge part of it. I mean, I suppose from the training as well, you know, showing that you are investing in people. But without kind of wanting to be flippant about it, I do think that, you know, it's actually a requirement of them doing that job, and it's a requirement of them, of, you know, claiming that mileage.
Absolutely second that. I don't think, you know, being compliant with your GreyFleet policy, you know, information on the vehicles that are driven on business for you, you know, that shouldn't be a carrot question. You know, you're not asking them to complete an employee survey, and if they do, you know, they get entered into a draw for an Amazon voucher. You know, that isn't the way that this should be approached. You know, you have a policy in place for a reason. There is health and safety legislation and law around why you need to have this information on these employees. So if you don't comply with it, well, then you either get your cash allowance removed or you can't claim mileage. And ultimately, if you can't use your car on business, if you take away that authorization, there needs to be a consequence for that. You know, there could be disciplinary action if you don't comply. It's more of a, this is a policy, this is what has to be done, rather than a, you know, like I said, here's an Amazon voucher if you complete the details. That's not the right kind of conversation, really.
Okay, thank you. A quick question. Someone says, apologies if this has been covered, but if there are two sites that are permanent place of work, do they still require business use cover? Emma? You
can't have two permanent places of work. HMRC, you have one, that's it. So even if you have a head office and then you have, you know, other offices in the country that your employees drive to, they are only allocated, or they will only be allowed one permanent workplace. So any other travel to any other office, any other depot, even if it's still within your own organisation, that will then be a business journey.
Okay.
I can't explain, you know, I can't get away from, it's one permanent place of work each employee has.
100% agree, yeah.
Excellent. Julie, can I just think in another question? Sorry, but if I don't know if any of Chris, you do this, or you've seen this, Alison, in any of the companies you work with. If there are any league tables of employee performance within your company around this, and is there issues around GDPR? And I also wonder on that question. We've had various questions asked about how do you overcome issues with drivers saying it's my data and you're not allowed to ask me for personal information, etc.
So in terms of league tables, we are actually going to use league tables as a tool to help us manage. To start with, we won't go into the detail of naming individuals. We'll go by regional business, and hopefully that there is. We would be guarded about posting people's personal data in league tables that everybody can see. We would rather tackle it via business and via management and via the processes we've got on. I think it's in terms of whether people are prepared or whether they're willing or unwilling to provide us with the detail. To me, we have a duty of care to manage our drivers. And so if our policy asks for somebody to supply business insurance breakdown cover, proof of ownership, proof of maintenance, that's a very, very reasonable request from the business. If somebody doesn't want to participate and provide that, then they can't drive on business. It's one of those ones where I think it's fundamental to the policy. I would question why somebody wouldn't want to provide that level of detail. You know, we have done a number of things with our company secretariat to make sure we store the data, so the data is not stored in anywhere where it can be accessed. We only keep it. We've got a policy around taking off leavers data after they've done. So we are only collecting and holding data that we need for our current employees and our current drivers. But it's one that, to me, is a zero tolerance. You know, we can't allow exceptions on people providing basic information.
Again, we have, I think we've got time for 3 more questions, James. I know there's lots there, but the next one for me is, when giving cash allowances, is it possible to demand the employee buys a vehicle less than 5 years old and, for example, Euro 6 or above?
Yeah, I mean, you just need to make sure it's part of your policy, you know, and that's up to, you know, each individual company will have their own policy, but I think most will have included in the policy age of vehicle, obviously the safety rating, and also, you know, things like mileage, because people aren't always buying new vehicles. So yeah, I think it's, you know, that's completely up to the company to specify those. As long as they are reasonable requests, then it's perfectly legitimate to do that. You just need to be very, very clear about it.
And is that something you would recommend?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would also 100% put CO2 rating in there as well, because we know that, you know, companies are have got a limited amount of time to start moving towards zero emissions, or, you know, very much reducing their emissions. And I don't see that the grey fleet should be any different. They're still working on behalf of that business, and the emissions really still should be part of the cumulative CO2 emission for that whole company.
It's a good point. Good point.
Chris, probably one for you now. Do you have any employees within your organisation that have been using the cash allowance, sort of, that have been exposed not to run a car, or in some cases you found drivers that aren't actually have a driving license, or employees that have no driving licenses and are still getting a cash allowance? Is that something you've come across in your population?
We yes, absolutely. It's quite minimal, fortunately for us, but certainly the driving license is one we pick up very early on, because as soon as someone joins, there's a link that says to do a license check, and we normally capture their license before we instruct payroll in terms of that. So you can't receive the allowance and you can't drive on business, obviously, if you haven't got a driving license. We have seen as we're now starting to check, we have seen a few people where they haven't got access to a vehicle. And it's a bit of a challenge at the moment, because with the government instruction of people to work from home where you can do, there's not the same necessity as there would be normally. But certainly we see it as critical. You know, you are asked to drive on business, therefore you need to have availability of a vehicle that's doing it. So we would just work with that person and make sure that they try and either get their own vehicle, or we supply them with a company vehicle. So they've got the both options. So we're trying to do it by coercing people into doing it. But yeah, there is examples, and I personally think we'll see more and more of this going forward, where people don't need to have vehicle ownership in order to carry out their normal duties, because the flexible working will enable them to be able to share vehicles or to work from home more.
Yeah. Can I just add something into that as well? And I think this can work really well for the company, the driver, but also as part of the kind of wider social responsibility, is to have something in place. I mean, company that we worked in, we called it green travel, but you know, I'm sure there are a number of schemes that actually, if you were entitled to a cash allowance, you could opt for something called green travel instead, which would give you exactly the same sum of money as a cash allowance for a vehicle, but you were only allowed to use public transport as part of your working day. So certainly for some of our contracts that centered around London and big cities, people actually found it, you know, it worked out financially well for them. And in terms of us, in terms of risk for the company, we worked out really well. And we had a massive uptake of people saying, actually, I don't want a company car or a GreyFleet type vehicle. I'll take the green travel and I'll use trains and buses and even taxis in some cases. And you know, it covered that amount of money, covered that really well for them.
There's our last question for today then. Should we have a separate GreyFleet policy to the general fleet policy document? Chris, bearing in mind how many car allowance employees you have, is that something you've considered?
Absolutely, we considered it, and at one stage that was going to be the route we went down, was separating out a kind of a GreyFleet or a driving policy and just having the company car offering as a separate one. We chose to keep it all in one document. But basically because we could signpost people to that one document, so they didn't need to read multiple documents, and it was our preferred way of having them in there. Personally, I think as long as you're giving people the information and the education and the instruction of what you want them to do, whether it sits in an individual policy or whether it sits in a combined policy, is not that important. It's about giving people that information.
I think also I actually really applaud that approach, Chris. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do, because we've already during these discussions kind of acknowledged that there's a real fractious approach to how safety is looked at in terms of GreyFleet compared to company vehicles, whether that's cars or not. And I think making it part of an overall policy says this isn't different in terms of how we look at this and in terms of the importance. And I think sometimes when you have a separate policy, you take it outside of that sphere, and I think it's really, really important to keep them together.
Okay, that's fabulous. Well, thank you very much for all your questions. Apologies if we didn't get to answer all of them, but we will be including the webinar recording into the AFP website and the slide deck as well, for future member reference. Before closing, I'd like to now hand back to Paul, who's going to share with you a number of white papers that AFP are ready to release. Paul.
Thanks, Julie. And wow, what a fantastic Q&A session and great presentations for our speakers. So thanks very much for that. James, can you just put the slide on for me, please? So just in terms of announcement from us, obviously the AFP is the industry body for fleet professionals. We're your body, so please support us, and we're here to help. We are committed to supporting our members. We've got our helpline and our admin centre. If there's any questions, fleet questions that you guys have got, please contact our admin centre and we will be happy to help out and support you guys. We are always the exponents of providing best practice documentation, education in the marketplace. Our Fleet Academy, the ICFM, trains hundreds of fleet managers every year, and we'd like you to include you guys if you think you need some better education, some understanding and some practical experience and knowledge. Obviously, as part of our commitment as well, we've got 5 committees. They shape our thoughts and best practice education and standards that we put out into the marketplace. These are all supported and run by fleet managers, us basically, and we are making sure that because of that output, we are lobbying on the conditions that we need as UK fleet operators to make sure that we can run national fleets. We are also network body, and we like connecting like-minded people together, so please support us. Watch out for our webinar program for 2021. All the details of all the webinars are on our website, the afp.co.uk. We have got the next few dates booked up already, which Julie will, I'm sure, will announce at the end of my session. And also, if you're not a member at the moment, please sign up and join the AFP. Individual packs now start at £99. Our webinars are very much free of charge this year, so please enjoy them. But next year they will be members only, so please start to get onto your individual journey of joining up. I'd now also like to announce we're issuing today 2 best practice documents into the marketplace. James, can you just change slide? The first one is Managing the Driver Business Journey Guide, and this is a high-level good read guide for fleet operators. It's designed to be able to provide a definition of what a business journey is, a definition of a commute, things like not celebrating high business mile drivers, the use of data, benchmarking instant rates, support that you need from your supply chain, policy considerations when employing occupational road risk strategies, and some driver comms policy and hints and tips on that guide as well. It's a good read. It will be available on our website from this afternoon, so please download it. It's a good one. The other one as well, topically for today, is the GreyFleet Vehicle Management Guide. Again, it's another great read. It's about supporting you guys in terms of your GreyFleet journey. A lot of us are still on our journey of managing our GreyFleet, and again with hints and tips to be able to make sure that you can deploy the things you want to deploy within your company. So thanks very much from me. I'm just going to hand back to Julie.
Okay, thank you all once again. I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking Alison, Emma and Chris for your support and superb presentations. Thank you very much indeed. Lots of positive comments coming back to us via the chat line, so that's great. Thank you for your time, and as Paul said, you know, we look forward to our next webinar. We'd ask you to put the date in the diary. It's planned for the 14th of April, and the topic is tax and the company vehicle. So it should be really technically, you know, a lot of technical information in that one. So look forward to seeing you all then, and thank you once again for your time.